All right. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Daniel Alonso Rivers. I'm going to be filling in as the chair for the panel right now. Jeff Santa Anna had an unavoidable, very last minute conflict, and he wasn't able to join at the start, but he may be able to join a little bit later on for the Q&A. And also, Amy Bong was pulled away by some developments happening on campus. Much like last fall, the solidarity protests and stuff escalating there. So she's doing the good work on the ground. But today's panel, let me pull up is titled More Unsettled Solidarities, Trans-Pacific Entanglements, Indigeneity, and Empire. And we're all just so grateful and excited that you all can join us. We've been, chomping at the bit to do this panel. So before we get started, I want to acknowledge that I am zooming in from the unceded homelands of the Ohlone Huichin people. And I'm going to go through the bios for all of our presenters. Maybe I'll save it and do each one before people present so that any latecomers get a chance to hear the bio for the work that they're about to hear. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first presenter. Rina Chua Garcia, she, her, Sia, is a creative and critical scholar from the Philippines who's currently based in the unceded Tuapu lands of Tuapu, which is lands of the Siak Onagonquin people. Apologies for the pronunciation on that. Rina was a 2022-2023 Jack and Doris Shanbolt Fellow in the Humanities at Simon Fraser University and a 2023 Effective Currents Institute Fellow at Dartmouth College. And she received her PhD from the University of British Columbia, where she's currently a research associate of environmental humanities and migrant ecologies. Her current book manuscript develops a framework of a migrant reading practice and analyzing curations, collations, and anthologies of literary and visual cultures. She's completing her poetry collection, A Geography of Unnatural and Natural Hazards, which is a visual and poetic response to migrant and arrivant cultures, liminal environments, and violences of form and language. And Rina, I'll let you introduce your paper title.
Hi, everybody. I just would like to say that we were working on technical stuff at the background. So my PowerPoint's supposed to be with the ASA coordinator who's helping us set this panel in motion. So hopefully that's going. Again, it's my pleasure to be here with everybody. And I'm Rina Garcia Chua. Thank you so much, Christine. I appreciate that. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. And for me, land acknowledgements have taken a completely different mold and form the past couple of months. I've been working on trying to really develop a land and labor acknowledgement that speaks to the current tides that we're in right now. So my presentation is called Following Currents Beneath. It's Arrivants Expressing Solidarity and Belongingness on Stolen Lands. And before I begin to get into the depth of my work, it is critical to this presentation and to the extent of my work that I recognize my belongingness as well on stolen lands. So I am a migrant from Manila, Philippines, who moved to the interior of British Columbia 7 years ago to continue my graduate studies in the environmental humanities. As I begin to dig deeply into this work and constantly perturbed by the unsettledness of my existence as a migrant mother, a Southeast Asian scholar, and a Filipinx woman in BC, I started engaging intimately with the land through the peoples of where I have arrived in, with the Silts or Okanagan peoples of Kelowna, and the Musqueam and Coast Salish peoples of Vancouver. Most importantly, I've learned how to engage with the peoples of these lands through the guidance and work of other arrivant and settler scholars, such as Harsha Walia, Mustafa Henaway, Rita Wong, Harry Aluri, and many more. My existence here in these lands mean that I am in some way participating in a colonial project that has promoted and globalized immigration from countries like mine to serve a neoliberal and colonial purpose, to extract resources or to serve those who extract resources from indigenous peoples. This is my meditation and my mediation on being an arrivant here in North America and following the currents set by Asians who have rippled the waters before me. The portion in the beginning of my presentation, the portion of that was a portion of Rita Wong and Fred was collaborative poem, Beholden, a poem as long as a river. So I want to expand on the word arrivant. I think of immigration, im/migration, as being an arrivant, especially for those of us, women laborers from so-called third world countries who are seen as warm body exports of neocolonial ruins of the empire. We come ordained by our governments that there is life better than what we imagine in the ruins of the empire in our nation states, and then take the same pathways so many migrants do due to the handshake deals of globalization between Western countries who need our entire bodies really to sustain imperial industries of extraction or service, and are countries that are hungry for remittances that buoy our economies. So I have here the definition of arrivants in front of you, and I just kind of want to expand my own mediation in this term. And I would say that not that arrivants do not eventually assimilate into settler. The distinction is important, but arrivants, there's a possibility that arrivants do assimilate into settlers. And what does that mean? Personally, I've seen this happen in so many Filipinos who, once their passports have changed or they have received a permanent resident card, suddenly begin to enact the same material and symbolic violences that settlers have enacted to fit in a fit to bid for belongingness in settler culture. Oftentimes, many Filipinos which wish to erase the brownness of their skins, literally and figuratively, to fit into a culture that they believe they deserve to also enjoy the fruits of their labor because they work hard, so they deserve to do this. The arrivant in my head is oftentimes a liminal state, the betwixt and between of belongingness. Sometimes liminal states are inherently violent and are difficult to overcome, especially during the process of transitioning from one space to the next. Often I find liminal states are important for our own consciousness, especially as migrants, because we can see from another space what the settler nation state enacts on its own citizenry. Rather than theorizing arrivants as disenfranchised and unbelonging, I argue that it is a state of belonging and cognizance. As categorized as arrivants, we are consciously pursuing the resistance against a colonial nation state through solidarity and community engaged work. So I take inspiration from Elike Bomer, who has presented a layered usage of the use of the word native. In using the term, post-colonial critics designate those who belong to a particular place by birth, and its connotative meaning has been transposed from the point of view of them to that of us. This presentation today also wishes to begin theorizing arrivants as a point of viewing of them to that of us. If we're attempting to engage in solidarity work as Asians in North America, this is us. Next slide, please. I so then trace the currents set before me by those who choose to resist and exist in this liminal state in North America. So there is no land for any of us if we all continue to steal and extract the lands that we are living on. Harry Aluri, who is half Filipino, half Punjabi, and is Canadian, is one of those who have gently guided me through his poems and his conversations to resisting the allure of white settler culture. This is his poem, No Language. I'll read a few lines from it. Can ever be enough. I say only the dirt will wash us clean. The way it must sound, and I cling to the languages, the dirt I've lost with the one that clings to me. So Harry has contributed poems to where this tracing has brought me, which is the project Fragmenting the West Coast, which I will talk about a little bit more later. For Hari, I find that his resistance is in ensuring that his voice as a poet is reflective of the true narratives in the lands he is in. This is why his counter-narratives in the poem reverberate with sharp contrasts. There is recognition of who he interpolates in unceded Musqueam lands, just as he recognizes his responsibility to the space he is in. Harry is also an activist, very generous with his time for Indigenous peoples and their rights. He is also, I think he also exemplifies something that I find very common among Asians who live in urban environments, such as Vancouver. So he takes to the street to protest Indigenous rights and eager volunteer for all these causes. Next slide, please. So I just want to show you a snippet of the project that Harry had contributed to, and this is a project that I did for my postdoc with Simon Fraser, which is called Fragmenting the West Coast. I trace currents here to the counter-narratives of migration and environment and the reckoning of belongingness in North America. In these poems, I find that there's an unsettling of being an arrivant and realizing that there are cross currents and interlocking systems of social and environmental injustice existing here that can be traced or mapped with the stories that we share about our own lived experience. Rita Wong was one of those who guided me that there is beyond what we call benevolent assimilation, and I borrow this term by Filipinx scholar Isan Juan. So what are our stories as Arrivants? How do we build solidarities with Indigenous rights in the spaces we're in? And also, what do we owe to our communities if we're working in solidarity with Indigenous communities? I ask that question here because I have no response yet. I'm continually building my response and my action towards these questions. And other than gentle interventions, when I see this same symbolic violence is enacted on Indigenous folks within my own community, I'm not really sure how to respond or to intervene other than the kinds of interventions that I do. Oftentimes the interventions that I do, which is trying to explain that this is a wrong course of action, it's met by nods and then, they want to change the subject basically. So next slide, please. So on one side of this current is a very real embodied experience of benevolent assimilation. What kind of new identity does years and years of indoctrination as the new heroes or bagong bayani, so many overseas Filipino workers have embodied and partaken in to create. So as we benevolently assimilate into settler culture, because this is what we believe it takes to be a good immigrant or be a successful immigrant, what violences do we permit and participate in? What do we continue to perpetuate? Rita Wong reminds me that there is the other side of the current too, a side that people like her continue to fight with, and that is solidarity with and coalition with Indigenous communities. Next slide, please. So this is taken from the Revelstoke Lake space of Columbia River, and I think this methodology that Fred Juan Rita traveled to the extent of the Columbia River together and wrote intensely together and listened to what the river is telling them and the histories of the river, and they wrote with this, is quite unique in its time space. And I would like to show you what it looked like in the gallery. Next slide, please. And so this is what it looks like. The poem is from River Relations, a beholder's share of the Columbia River. And this is a sustained dialogue with the land and with their identities and belongingness as arrivants and or settlers in the nation state. So I'm going to skip a couple of slides because I saw Daniel waving that flag of that time is up. But of course, I asked here a lot of questions to continue the conversation. So
you've still got another minute and a half too.
Oh, okay, yeah, I'll wrap up. Thanks, Daniel. Next slide, please. This is something from Laiwan, and it is from Rita's advice as well, to look into Laiwan's fountain, the source of origin or anything. And this is a photographic mural at the wall in CBC Plaza in Vancouver, and it's all about the Georgia Viaduct seen from the intersection of Kiefer and Columbia Waters in Vancouver's Chinatown, a very important cultural landmark in Musqueam lands. So next slide, please. So inspired by Rita's words, Harry's urging, and Laiwan's work, I decided to start writing. And my question first was, what is truth? What is this Truth and Reconciliation, right? There's a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada right now, and I have questions about that. And this is a poem in progress in my upcoming poetry collection. And this is how I respond to overwhelm, to disgust, to anger, exasperation, and awe, really. It's a mirror holding it back on us, a mirror that we look at, because I like to write my poetry as is also a part of understanding what a counter narrative is. What's the counter narrative in media? And this is what we say about TRC, or Truth and Reconciliation, but what are the public really saying? And it's good and bad both ways. So this is the beginnings of it. And this is also saying, this is who we are. Now what? What do we do? I'm just going to wrap up here. Next slide, please. I want to direct everybody's attention. I'm thinking of Amy right now, and Amy's work on the ground there, and so many of us who are going through unsettledness, and we're fighting for lives being lost every day. And even though it seems to be in another part of the world, this is part of us as well. When we're thinking about solidarities, how do we continue building these coalitions beyond what we're doing right now here on the ground? Will it ever be enough? And I take this from Rinaldo Walcott's Diaspora Against a Nation State in Briarpatch magazine. Please read the essay. It's a fantastic discourse on how the diaspora can resist the nation state. But also, I'm attending a teach-in with the Stuart Hall Foundation right now on Hall's work, West versus the Rest, and I attended a session this week with Ilan Pape and Premyavada Gopal. And the challenge Premyavada says is, it is time to think about what decolonization truly means as we grapple with the crisis of genocide, colonization, and dispossession and occupation. What is a radical imagining of our solidarity so that it transcends your Americans' master's tools and build coalitions with each other and the more than human world? So how do we continue reimagining the world with the crisis around us? Next slide, please. Maraming salamat po. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rena. And we'll be doing Q&A at the end, of course. So I'm just going to keep us moving to give us plenty of time for that. And Jeff, welcome. It's great to see you. So our next speaker is Lisa Fink. Lisa is an NPS Mellon Humanities postdoctoral fellow who lives and works in Tenaya land in Anchorage, Alaska. Their research and teaching explore human nature and human-animal interaction in the context of U.S. empire, settler colonialism, racial formation, and environmental change by investigating environmental culture, law, policy, and practice. Their scholarly writing has appeared in or is forthcoming in American Quarterly, ISLE, Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and the Environment, and Humanities. Their current book project, Unsettled Ecologies, traces contemporary environmental discourse, thought, and practice regarding species considered invasive from Western colonial, diasporic, Arrivant, and Indigenous perspectives, especially as it pertains to climate change. And Lisa, I'll let you introduce your own paper title.
Thanks, Daniel. Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. All right, can you all see that? I can't see you, so.
We can all see it and it looks great.
Okay, great. And just so you know, I won't be able to see when you hold up the signs about the time. Just FYI. I might go over a little, apologies, but I'll jump into it. So thanks everyone for being here. As Daniel said, I'm coming to you from Dena'ina lands on what is called Anchorage now. I was born and raised on Wapakute lands, which is an Isanti group of the Oceti-Sakowin. I'm descendants of Swedish and German immigrants. My paper is titled Unsettled Ecologies, Asian American and Indigenous Entanglements in the Settler Racial Discourse of Invasion. So in this paper, I consider the possibilities for solidarity between Asian diasporic and Indigenous communities who are entangled in racial discourses of invasion that are applied both to human and non-human communities. Scholars such as Banu Subramaniam and Jeannie Shinizuka identify the perils between anti-immigrant and anti-invasive species rhetoric, what I jointly refer to here as the racial discourse of invasion. In my own work, I investigate how this discourse of invasion reinforces settler colonial claims, procedures, and technologies that are entangled with race, gender, class, and sexuality. So today I want to share with you some of the ways that communities and writers are challenging this discourse, which I think suggests potential grounds for solidarity. So to begin with, Korean American poet Ed Bockley's 2019 poem, Super Insensitive Species, helps illustrate how Asian immigrants and Asian Americans are constructed discursively as supposedly alien, supposedly invasive, through a racial discourse of invasion as part of a settler colonial project, and how that rhetoric parallels dominant discourses of species invasion. The poem is a dramatic monologue. The poet in it inhabits the point of view of the Asian alien, the carp, in response to dominant invasive species discourses, really epitomized by this article shown here on the screen. It's a 2013 Scientific American article titled "Invasion USA, Asian Carp Invaders Have Taken the Mississippi, Are the Great Lakes Next?" And he references this article specifically in the poem's epigraph. So the poem highlights the linked gendered and racial projects of settler colonialism when it asks, quote, "How could you forget the Chinese Exclusion Act? 500,000 top-knots wishing not only to dig and blast, but breed." Here he's referencing the contradiction between how the United States encouraged Chinese immigration for low-wage labor to further white settlers' efforts to access and settle indigenous lands, but at the same time severely restricted it to maintain the nation state's objective of building a white nation and maintaining whites' power over the land. Additionally, stanzas such as "Myriad in late-night cram schools of swishing bubbles like slitty mermaids at your sailors' hulls," unquote, evoke stereotypes of numerousness and unmanageable reproduction, which echoes the supposed over-reproduction of the fish, while also evoking the model minority myth and the supposed sexual availability of Asian and Asian American women, which Natalie Cisneros has theorized as Asian or alien sexuality. So Lee constellates these stereotypes here alongside the settler colonial erasure of indigenous peoples and the production of settler ecologies as part of colonial ecological violence, to use J.M. Bacon's term. The poet asks, "Where did all the black elks, standing bears, and Pocahontases go?" And then a little later, "Who brought whose eggs and minnows here to invade whose waters, lands, and purity in the first place?" So the poet italicized the word invade to emphasize that Euro-American settlers were the invaders who continue to occupy indigenous lands. The poem is revealing the interrelation between the introduction of the carp, cycles of acceptance and rejection of Asian laborers that hew closely with economic conditions, and the erasure of Oglala, Lakota, Ponca, and Powhatan peoples while deploying their historical figures as abstractions to suit settler narratives. And the poem as a whole is really playfully working through irreverence, outrage, outrageousness to challenge colonial and racial discourses of invasion that construct Asian as alien, while at the same time obscuring European invasion, settlement, and occupation of indigenous lands and livelihoods. So Lee is really also, well, at the same time, the poet is challenging this racial discourse of invasion by also ironically championing the carp's resistance to containment and control, which is a move, I think, toward also a multi-species solidarity. But at the same time, you know, there's this tension that exists between that resistance and its occurrence on occupied Indigenous lands. So as this really brief, close reading suggests, dominant discourses of species invasion and anti-immigrant rhetoric are part of a wide-ranging colonial and racial discourse of invasion with a long history in the United States. U.S. historian Natalia Molina's concepts of racial scripts is helpful, I think, for better understanding how this discourse of racialized invasivity functions as part of settler colonialism. And Molina offers this concept of racial scripts to describe how racial ideas are reapplied to in different moments of time, to different groups, to racialize them as non-white, and to exclude them in some form. So the script of racialized invasivity constructs various groups at different points in time as threats to the nation, the white nation specifically. It's a, you know, definitely a white nationalist and white supremacist move using this umbrella metaphor of invasion. So, for example, early settlers in the 17th century characterized the Narragansetts, Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Wabanaki, these people who were defending their lands. Settler characterized them as invaders. And Wakaso scholar Nick Estes contends that these kinds of accounts portray colonization, quote unquote, upside down. So that, quote, invasion looks like self-defense, with settlers and their militarized forts meant to look like the real victims of an encircling native aggression, unquote. So this national narrative repeats itself in the racial script of invasivity that's used to construct the alien, the supposed alien, as the aggressive invading other, often to justify elimination, exploitation, exclusion, and extreme violence, as we see today at the US-Mexico border and in many other places around the world. Another example of how this is applied at a different time, in this next case I'll mention to Mexican immigrants. Otto Santayana's study of the news media's use of metaphorical language was looking at California's Prop 187 in the 90s. He identifies how the metaphor immigrants as invaders was used to describe Mexican immigrants. And Santayana cites, for example, this quotation in the top right of the screen from the Los Angeles Times from 1996. I don't want us to look like that country. If we continue this alien invasion, we will be like Mexico. So we, of course, we see this echoed. I mean, probably this is sounding, unfortunately, very familiar to many of us. We see it echoed in contemporary U.S. discourse that frames Central American migrants and Black migrants from the Caribbean and Africa as invaders. And there's another example on the screen. I'm just going to move on because of time. But beyond, you know, alongside all of this, Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers really connect this kind of discourse, this colonial and racial discourse of invasion, to their experiences with both white supremacy and anthropocentrism, especially as it relates to species that some call invasive. So Anishinaabe knowledge keepers, whom I interviewed, see themselves as similarly impacted by this racial discourse of invasion, as they've also been charged with being outsiders, even while residing on their ancestral lands. One knowledge keeper shared, quote, I know what it's like to be an outsider and not be accepted. As sometimes the only Native person in school, I was considered unwanted. So I can imagine what a plant feels like when it's unwanted. Similarly, another person I interviewed connected the treatment of Native people with the treatment of these species. And there's a long quote here on the screen, which I'm going to read in its entirety. On the right-hand side is Queen Anne's lace, a common quote unquote invasive, which has medicinal properties that the Anishinaabe use it for. So here's the quotation quote. When this country was founded, the indigenous people here were looked at as a problem, right? And looked at in a negative light, a negative connotation. We were vilified, misunderstood. With that, there's this perspective of dominion over, or better than anything else, that gives people the social license to do what they will to other sovereign beings. We've had that figured out as Ojibwe people since the beginning of our time, because we still recall and remember our original teachings and our place as someone that relies on everything else around us, and that we don't dictate and we don't do with those things around us as we see fit necessarily, because that's not our place. We know we're a part of everything else around us. So when we start using terms like invasive species and stuff like that, it still has that dominance dynamic. And so I can't really agree to it, unquote. So this Anishinaabe knowledge holder connects that discourse of invasion applied to indigenous communities with invasive species discourse as part of Western processes of ordering that are used to assert dominion over and subjugate various groups, whether they're human groups or more than human groups. And in this way, many Anishinaabe understand this concept of invasive species as a symptom of colonial and capitalist relations. So at the same time, such species do negatively impact treaty-protected resources that are vital to tribes' subsistence economies, to their culture, to intergenerational knowledge sharing. However, for many tribal members, these species do not inherently lead to negative outcomes. So an example comes from Elder Giwegijikwe Martin, who shares her excitement at becoming familiar with new plants and animals. And this quotation is also on the screen. She says, "To me, it's wonderful to see a new living being. I'll look them up and I'll study and I'll ask other elders and say, have you seen this? Do you know anything about it? I need to know how I can live on this earth in balance with them, alongside of them, walk with them." So Martin views these beings as relations, bringing food and medicine and other gifts. This approach really emphasizes Anishinaabe epistemologies and ontologies by understanding these species as potential relations with whom they want to live, quote, in a good way, unquote, and thus propose an indigenous ethic for living well together with both humans and with both non-humans and humans, which currently includes indigenous peoples, diasporic peoples, and settlers who are all living together. As Martin observes, quote, "We're all connected and we're all alive and a part of the circle," unquote. So to wrap up, my aim in bringing together these texts and perspectives is to engage what Tuck and Yang in Decolonization is Not a Metaphor call an ethic of incommensurability, which recognizes what is distinct and what cannot be conflated in, for example, human and civil rights-based social justice projects, such as immigrant organizing, and then in decolonization efforts such as land back and other land rematriation projects and struggles. So in recognizing what is distinct between, say, Asian American responses to alienated species and indigenous perspectives on those species, I mean to explore the tensions between them and to let those tensions be there. And like Allison Jones and Quynh Jenkins write, examine the possibilities rather than dissolving, softening, or erasing, so that we might think, quote, within the negotiated relations of whose story is being told, why, to whom, with what interpretation, and whose story is being shadowed, why, for whom, and with what consequence. So these distinctions, letting them stand with one another unsettlingly is so important. But at the same time, what that does is highlight structures of violence in ways that allow a better understanding of those structures, as well as calling attention to radical responses that expose and challenge the structures while providing examples of, for example, reciprocal land relations synonymous with liberation struggles. Thanks so much. I'm going to stop sharing when I figure out how to do it. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lisa, for sharing your work. And I noticed we maybe have a few more people in the room than at the start, so thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to keep us moving, so we have all that time for Q&A. Next up, we have Alyssa Hunziker, pronouns she, her. Alyssa is an assistant professor of English at Oklahoma State University, where she researches and teaches in the field of Native American and Indigenous literatures. She is the book review editor for American Indian Quarterly and co-editor of a double special issue of college literature titled Genres of Empire. Her recent publications appear or are forthcoming in American Quarterly, American Periodicals, Multi-Ethnic Literatures of the U.S., Studies in American Indian Literatures, and Settler Colonial Studies. And Alyssa, I'll let you introduce your paper title.
Thank you so much. All right, let's see if I can share my screen. All right, hopefully you can see that, and I can also no longer see you. So I guess someone shout if you can't see my presentation. Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our panel, and thank you so much to Lisa for organizing it. Today I'm going to be presenting some very new material from my book project, which focuses on the relationship between settler colonialism in Native North America and the U.S.'s Pacific Empire. And specifically, the project is asking how U.S. empire ended up inadvertently connecting Indigenous communities from North America to the Pacific Islands and to Southeast Asia. And then secondly, how Native American and Indigenous authors think through their relationships to other Indigenous communities in the course of empire. Today, I'm going to be thinking through the work of two contemporary writers who will likely be familiar to this group, Chamorro poet and scholar Craig Santos-Perez and Marshallese poet Kathy Jetnil-Kijiner, both of whom ground their work in Guam and the Marshall Islands respectively, and yet both make frequent appeals to Native North Americans. Today, I'll argue that these poets' frequent appeals to North American indigeneity signals a kind of trans-indigenous poetics. And here I'm borrowing from Chadwick Allen's work on the trans-indigenous. And in particular, I'm focusing on Perez and Jetnil-Kijiner's responses to the 2016 No DAPL movement, which sought to protect Standing Rock Sioux waters against the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. So I'll start there. Again, a history that this room is probably very familiar with. In 2016, the Standing Rock Sioux fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline and subsequent encampments saw not only the largest gathering of Indigenous nations since the 1973 occupation at Wounded Knee, but also saw solidarity delegations across the US and globally. What began as a small encampment established by Standing Rock elder and historian LaDonna Braypool Allard in April would eventually balloon to a movement with thousands of water protectors on the ground, as according to Nick Estes and Jaskron Dillon, more than 300 Native nations and countless allied movements planted their flags in solidarity at the Aseti-Shakoan camp. Not only did the movement bring wide international recognition to issues of Indigenous sovereignty and environmental justice, No DAPL also saw transnational solidarity movements from around the globe in places across Oceania, Latin America, Europe, and Asia, which came from both Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities. And these kind of international movements connected the local fight at Standing Rock back to their own home communities. Alongside solidarity marches and delegations, I focus in particular on several solidarity poems that were written in the wake of No DAPL. So to back up just a bit, both Perez and Jetnil-Kijiner are known primarily for their works as eco-poets who attend to both past and present US military violence in their respective home islands. In particular, much of Jetnil-Kijiner's work centers a legacy of US nuclear weapons testing in the Marshall Islands, and Perez similarly focuses both on the US military's occupation in Guam, but also the kind of history and legacy of Guam's past and present as an unincorporated territory of the US. So this is just to say that while I'm focusing on these poets' appeals to Native North America, the vast majority of their work is focused instead on Chamorro and Marshallese histories, respectively. So I want to turn to two poems published originally on Perez's blog. In the first, Interwoven, Perez is careful not to conflate different Indigenous histories in the poem, which is dedicated to Native American cousins. Interwoven begins with a reminder and a refrain. I come from an island and you come from a continent, and that persists throughout each new section of the poem. While Perez is clear that Native and Chamorro histories are distinct and not conflatable, the yet which follows each repetition of the island-continent separation points to histories in common, from European colonialism to US-sponsored colonial boarding schools, language theft, genocide, military encroachment, and the ongoing dangers of extractive industries which continue to steal native lands. For instance, acknowledging the difference between island and continent, Perez writes, "Yet we both know invasion. Magellan breached our reef 30 years after Columbus raided your shore. Yet we both know the walls of boarding schools, and yet we both know desecration, including minerals, trees, wildlife, and food crops extracted for profit." The poem's repeated refrain, I come from an island and you come from a continent yet, refuses to overly generalize or universalize different Indigenous contexts, while nonetheless pointing to shared histories of empire, including the ongoing dangers of extractive industries. The second half of the poem also moves beyond colonial histories, as Perez attempts to imagine trans-Indigenous and trans-Pacific futures. Citing shared care for lands and waters, and ongoing inspiration for Chamorros from their Native American cousins, Perez ends the poem with hope. I hope our descendants will continue interweaving our struggles. I hope the stories we share today and in the future will carry us toward sovereign horizons. While colonial violence becomes the initial inspiration for interwoven stories in the poem, he suggests that these shared histories leave space for trans-Indigenous solidarity and collective organizing, building another kind of unsettled solidarity in the wreckage of empire. And in many ways, Interwoven would engage with the international solidarity movements of the 2016 No Dapple movement, as well as Perez's own No Dapple poem, Chanting the Waters. So like the dedication in Interwoven, Chanting the Waters is written in solidarity with the Standing Rock Sioux tribe and all peoples protecting the sacred waters of this earth. While the poem begins by speaking quite broadly to statistics, citing universal claims about humans' relationships to water, the poem is also deeply grounded in trans-Indigenous context, repeating Dakota Water Protector's slogan that water is life every 4 lines throughout the poem. Like Interwoven, Chanting the Waters points to shared Indigenous struggles over water rights across Standing Rock homelands to Hawaii and Guam, as Perez appeals to corporations who steal, privatize, dam, and bottle our waters, sugar, pineapple, corn, soy, and GMO plantations that divert our waters, and pesticides, chemical, oil, weapons, and waste that poison our waters. The shift to our here points to a shared Indigenous experience, despite the very different territories in which these extractive practices are occurring. So while the beginning of the poem has this very broad kind of universal appeal, it then shifts into a they-we formulation as Perez invokes a trans-Indigenous we. We say stop, you are hurting our ancestors. We say stop, water is sacred. We say we are not leaving. Rather than conflating Chamorro and Dakota experiences though, Perez instead seeks to build solidarity across different Indigenous contexts. And this really culminates in the poem's ending, which considers the ways the Pacific Ocean links Guam and Hawaii to the Standing Rock Sioux Nation. Citing the hydrologic cycle, which circulates water from ocean to cloud to rain and back again, Perez writes, water is life because my daughter loves playing in the ocean, because someday she will ask us, where does the ocean end? Because we will tell her that the ocean has no end. Because we will tell her that the ocean, sky, rain, lake flows into the Missouri River and connects us to our cousins at Standing Rock. Because we will tell her that the Sioux are still there and still breathing. Tracing the ways the hydrologic cycle links oceanic and fresh waters, Perez removed distinctions between the Pacific Ocean and the Missouri River, claiming both as Indigenous homelands under threat from both settler nations and multinational corporations. Ending the poem with both Chamorro language and Standing Rock Water Protector's refrain that water is life, The poem grounds itself in a particular moment, reinforcing Standing Rock Sioux sovereignty while linking this fight to other Indigenous claims over land and territory. And I'll just very quickly turn to one last poem before wrapping up, which is to say that No Dapple was also inspiration for Marshallese poet Kathy Chetnell-Kitchener. In a 2016 blog post, Chetnell-Kitchener responded to the September 5th, 2016 attack on water protectors who had attempted to stop construction on an ancestral burial ground and were met with private security and attack dogs. Thinking across Dakota and Marshallese experiences, Chetnell-Kitchener wrote for the water protectors, which she frames as a small offering from the Marshall Islands from your ally who is a shark. The short 20-line poem considers multiple generations of Indigenous resistance, wondering how violent responses to sovereignty movements impact future generations, and if contemporary resistance can be felt by ancestors. Using the Trans-Indigenous hour, Chetnell-Kitchener's poem, like Perez's, is grounded in the specifics of the protest while also thinking across Indigenous and Trans-Pacific contexts, including legacies of nuclear testing in the Marshalls and the Dakota Access Pipeline's threat to Standing Rock Sioux waters. Chetnell-Kitchener is clear that the protests are taking place in Dakota starlit night, and the poem responds to that day's attack. Yet she also explores Trans-Indigenous relationalities, asking, do the teeth dig across realities? Does the blood stain across oceans? What is shared by Dakota and Marshallese peoples in the poem is at once the ongoing threat of environmental colonialism, harming the lives of Indigenous peoples and their descendants. Yet as an interwoven, Chetnell-Kitchener also considers the importance of solidarity movements across Indigenous communities. While the majority of Chetnell-Kitchener and Perez's works are situated in the Pacific Islands, these repeated appeals to North American indigeneity signal an attempt to think, in Chetnell-Kitchener's words, across oceans, and in Perez's, toward sovereign horizons. They offer another kind of unsettled solidarity, as each poet underscored shared fights for environmental justice and Indigenous sovereignty with Native communities in North America, while also highlighting their own complex positions as subjects of both past and present US colonial rule. And just as I finish up, a few poets I wasn't able to discuss who are also thinking about the relationship between Native North America, Guam, and American Samoa. Thank you.
What wonderful work. Thanks for sharing, Alyssa. That certainly brings me back to those poems in new ways, though, as you say, they're probably familiar to many of us in this room. And those are lovely readings and engagements. Thank you. So to keep us moving, next up is going to be Jane Komori. So Jane is a postdoctoral fellow in the history department at the University of British Columbia. Her research theorizes the settler ecology of Western Canada as a complex of extractive and agricultural industries driven by the recruitment of Asian and Indigenous workers from the 1850s through the Second World War. And Jane, I'll let you introduce your paper.
Great, thank you so much. To Daniel for introducing me, and to Lisa for organizing this, and to everyone for being here in a moment that is deeply sort of distracting, moving, horrifying on our campuses. I'm happy to be able to share this space with you all in the midst of it. Can you see? You can see my slides. Great. So I'll just jump right into it. In 1835, John Dunn, a Hudson's Bay Company trader, made an expedition to what is now British Columbia's north coast. Of that trip, Dunn writes, "We made a very important discovery, a rich mine of coal near the surface. The cause of the discovery was as curious as the discovery itself was important. Some of the natives at Fort McLaughlin having, on coming to the fort for traffic, observed coal burning in the furnace of the blacksmith, and in their natural spirit of curiosity made several inquiries about it. They were told that it was the best kind of fuel and that it was brought over the Great Salt Lake, 6 months' journey." This is still Dunn talking. They looked surprised, and in spite of their habitual gravity, laughed and capered about. The servants of the fort were surprised by their unusual antics and inquired the cause. The Indians explained, saying that they had changed, in a great measure, their opinions of the white men, whom they thought endowed by the Great Spirit with the power of effecting great and useful objects. As it was evident, they were not then influenced by his wisdom in bringing such a vast distance and at so much cost that black, soft stone, which was in abundance in their country. Dunn proceeded to investigate and found that there was indeed abundant coal of excellent quality on Vancouver Island. Further, he wrote that, and these are his words again, the natives were anxious that the company should employ them to work the coal, and because they were so numerous and their labor so cheap, Dunn and his colleagues concluded that to work the coal themselves would have been, again, their term, it would have been madness. Madness, first to ship coal from South Wales or Ayrshire around Cape Horn in order to burn it in fur trading forts on the edge of the British Empire. But for the Quynh, who Dunn referred to in his story, this was enough to dispel any respect for the knowledge of company men. And then on the other hand, it was from the perspective of the company men, it was madness not to employ the willing, quote unquote, natives to extract the black, soft stone once the company knew of its existence. Intensive coal mining began quickly after Dunn's quote unquote discovery. In the process, the Hudson's Bay Company hurriedly sought to extinguish Indigenous title to the land and its minerals. Governor James Douglas assured the company's board that he would secure a treaty with the Nanaimo at what's now called Nanaimo, quote, as soon as I think it's safe and prudent to renew the question on Indian rights, which always gives rise to troublesome excitements and has on every occasion been productive of serious disturbances, end quote. Serious disturbances indeed. The Quynh and the Nanaimo, who are pictured on this slide, both struggled for years to retain control over their land, but also to maintain their pivotal position in the emerging industry's labor market. In the early years of coal mining, the Hudson's Bay Company was almost entirely dependent on Indigenous workers to operate the mines, and these workers knew their importance when they struck over compensation and in protest of mistreatment, even once blockading the pits at Fort Rupert to protest the arrival of Scottish miners. In doing so, the Quynh and the Nanaimo responded to their unique circumstances as people dispossessed of their land, but also as a labor force with significant leverage, at least for a brief period, in the fledgling colony. But the surface coal, so the coal sort of sitting right at the top of the ground, the surface coal at Fort Rupert and around Nanaimo was quickly depleted, and demand for coal along the West Coast was only growing. The industry therefore shifted towards underground operations, the form of which was dictated by the peculiar geology of the local coal formation. So the thickness of the region's coal seams is highly variable, which was a fact that led to significant variation in mining techniques, labor management practices, and racial dynamics underground. The Scottish miners, whose arrival had led to violent confrontations with Quynh workers, brought with them two different systems for mining coal. For thicker seams, they used the pillar and stall method, which is what's up on this slide, where a small team consisting of a miner and his assistants would carve out a room in the coal face, leaving behind pillars to support the ceiling. They used the long wall method for thinner seams, where miners undercut the coal face and removed the coal as it fell, like in this slide. And this difference was actually really important. In long wall mines, laborers could be supervised directly by a single foreman, and the mining company would therefore hire large numbers of so-called unskilled Chinese and Japanese workers to man the long wall. But there were Asian workers in pillar and stall mines too, although rather than being hired directly by the company, they were contracted as helpers to white colliers. White skilled miners were paid on a piece rate and could maximize their profits by having Chinese and Japanese workers drill blasting holes, load carts, and haul them to the surface. Asian workers also joined Indigenous workers in completing much of the work at the surface of both types of mine. Together, they sorted the coal, transported it to the rail lines that would carry the coal to the wharves, and loaded it onto waiting ships. In other words, from the 1860s through the early 20th century, Indigenous, Asian, and white workers, as ill-defined as that category actually was during this period, all these workers were arrayed around the pits in complex hierarchies that were derived from the combination of British mining techniques, the warp and weft, that is the sort of weird shape of the local coal fields, and the constraints and possibilities of early British Columbia's faltering settlement policies and burgeoning resource economy. How each of these groups of workers was racialized depended on the success of the mines, the labor organizing taking place within them, and the geological conditions underground. For example, in the early days of mining at Fort Rupert, the Queggles were sometimes described as being the quote-unquote best friends of the Hudson's Bay Company. But when they insisted on certain rights and benefits, one company man wrote that they were, quote, worse than useless if not kept under the strictest surveillance. On the other hand, the 1885 Royal Commission into Chinese immigration concluded that because of the similarity between mining work and the cultivation of rice, wherein, as they put it, the workman squats on his hands, therefore Chinese workers were particularly well suited to the mining industry, a conclusion that went against the full-throated demands for exclusion that were coming from white workers and their unions. The commissioners sided with mine bosses when they posed this rhetorical question in their report. As to the employer of labor, when the labor is there, has he not a right to utilize it? Their answer, or the conclusion that they arrived at, was strikingly similar to the one that John Donne, the Hudson's Bay Company explorer, had arrived at 50 years earlier. It would have been madness not to. The subsequent 1901 Commission on Asian Immigration also determined that Japanese workers presented no significant threat to the security of white mine workers, and many bosses suggested that Japanese and Chinese workers were basically interchangeable. But as conditions in the mines worsened, race would become a major flashpoint for labor conflict. Due to high levels of oxygen and hydrogen in the region's coal, these were some of the most dangerous pits in the British Empire. Even more than in other coal fields then, the island's colliers were, as an 1888 Commission into Labor Issues put it, a race apart, constituted of queer people, canny, suspicious of danger, ever on the defensive. Indeed, the danger of the pits would lead to terrible disasters that stoked singularly militant labor action among mine workers, dividing the race apart along further racial lines. One miner described the situation this way: who wouldn't fight if there were laws for the safety of the miner and they were not enforced? How do you like to go into the bowels of the earth if you wasn't sure at what minute an explosion might come? But when white miners struck over safety and wages, however, companies were quick to hire in their place the very same Chinese and Japanese workers who had learned their trade through years of work as the underpaid assistants to the very same white miners. This, alongside the constant fear that animated each day's work, was too much for organized white labor. White miners actually finally won the exclusion of Asian workers through strikes and other labor actions, following two explosions in the late 1880s, which together killed more than 200 workers. But even after the ban on Asian labor underground was imposed, Chinese and Japanese workers still performed crucial work above and sometimes even below ground in the mines for decades to come. And Asian workers, like Indigenous workers, did not passively accept their conditions. They struck over low wages, job insecurity, segregation to the worst positions, and exclusion from the benefits of labor unions. One white miner recalled that, and I'm quoting him here, if they laid off one Chinaman, the next day there wouldn't be a bloody Chinaman around. 500 Chinamen. They wouldn't go back to work till that guy got his job back, end quote. Chinese and likely Japanese workers' strikes, slowdowns, and other labor actions persisted for decades, although often in a less formal manner than unionized white workers, and therefore with far fewer records left to us today. So while each group arrived at the mines through unique circumstances, growing dispossession and proletarianization in the case of Indigenous peoples, and contract labor schemes brought from imperialism across the Pacific in the case of Asian workers, they were all these workers were thrown together in the dark engine of British Columbia's early economy. Hundreds would perish there in the explosive bowels of the earth. But that risk and the unequal distribution of it would be the impetus for many labor struggles. Some of these, I wager, contested not only working conditions, but perhaps the very nature of settler colonial resource extraction itself. And then the final thing I'll say by way of conclusion, in 1952, a coal mining operation was again opened near Fort Rupert, more than a century after the Quagos first showed John Donne the coal there. For the new Sasquatch Collieries logo, the company used a stunning symbol of the quote-unquote natives to whom the industry is owed. But this mine, too, would not last, as oil from California increasingly undermined Vancouver Island coal's position as the West Coast's premier fossil fuel. The way was paved for new forms of resource extraction, and the people who had been drawn into coal's labor force were, at best, forgotten, at worst, immortalized in the company archives as avatars of the wealth that once lay unnoticed beneath the feet of the fur traders. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jane, for sharing your work. So we have one more paper left, and then we'll get into the Q&A. And I will read my own bio.
Daniel, do you want me to introduce you? Could I have the honor, since you've been so kind as to take over from me, because I had that medical appointment. But I would be honored if you'd let me introduce you.
Oh, thanks, Jeff. And for those of you who don't know, this is Jeffrey Santa Anna, our panel chair, who's able to join us after all, and we're all delighted. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you so much. Okay, Daniel Lanza Rivers is a queer non-binary scholar and assistant professor of American Studies and Literature at San Jose State University, where they also serve as director of the Martha Heasley Cox Center for Steinbeck Studies. Daniel's recent publications include American Quarterly, Terrain.org, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the Steinbeck Review. Their book, Life Outside, Speculative Ecologies, Decolonial Relations, is forthcoming from Duke University Press, 2025. Daniel, I'll let you introduce your own paper.
Thanks, Jeff. And yeah, the timing's probably a bit ambitious. The book will probably be 2026 or so. We'll see. But it's getting there. Thanks. And I have a set of slides that I think are wonderful sort of tech moderators. Oh, thank you so much. So as you can see here, my paper is called Speculations of Abundance, Trans-Pacific Empire and Indigenous California Worlds. So I'll begin. California has always been a settler speculation, a fantasy of geography and profit that's been deployed to marshal the military, financial, and political force of settlers who believed they could use the tool, or that the tools of conquest, statecraft, and environmental manipulation can produce a manipulable environment of abundance and extraction. As a case study of speculation, California offers insight into the entanglements among transnational, imperial, and industrial modes of colonization that have operated throughout the Americas for 5 centuries, since the start of what Macarena Gómez-Barrés calls the colonial Anthropocene. For Gómez-Barrés, thinking the colonial Anthropocene shifts, quote, how we imagine the root causes of climate change, and opens a way to ask how we can live how can we live otherwise? I take up this question in this paper by placing histories of colonization on the Pacific slope in conversation with work from contemporary Indigenous artists, specifically Shauna Oteka-Makovi, who's Yurok and Karuk, and Deborah Miranda, who's Ohlone Kostanoa Neslan. In addition to reviewing how Spanish and U.S. speculations of abundance emerged from the projects of Trans-Pacific Empire, this paper queries the ways that McCovey and Miranda use indigenous and decolonial practices of speculation to articulate forms of relation and abundance that push outside and against the settler projects of speculation and extraction. Next slide, or actually this slide, if you don't mind. Never mind. I think we're going back one. I think we're still good with the first slide. So long before Alta California was territorialized by Spain, Mexico, and the US, the region's imagined geographies took shape within the Spanish imperial discourse. Like the proverbial map that precedes the territory, California's name came first, appearing in the pages of a popular Spanish novel where Khalifa referred to an island nation populated by dark-skinned warrior women. Some of the earliest European maps of the territory, like the one here, reflect this novelistic invention. And this one's by Joan Vickenboons, and it's from around 1650. And it figures the region as an island hanging off the western edge of North America. Like the Philippines, the California territory was first imagined as has only functioned as a singular and coherent political geography within the perceptual imaginaries and material institutions of settler conquest. The region's life as a settler speculation began in the late 16th century as sailors in Spain's Manila galleon trade began surveying the Pacific slope for sites of rest and resource extraction. And let's move to the next slide, if you don't mind. Established in 1567 and lasting for 4 centuries, the Manila galleon trade undertook an estimated 110 voyages that used the Pacific Gyre, a clockwise turning current that circulates in the Pacific. It's the one that's made famous in Tale for the time being, and transported silver mined by unfree indigenous people in the Americas to the Spanish imperial capital of the Philippines in Manila. The turning of the gyre made the galleon's westward trip from the Americas to the Philippines relatively brief, lasting only 75 to 90 days. Ships that made the return current eastward across the Pacific tracked further north and relied on what's called the Kuroshio current, which runs between Japan and the west coast of North America. These eastward voyages could last up to 6 months, and the galleon's Filipino, Spanish, Chinese, and Mestizo crew members often found their rations reduced to make room for commodities. The vicious effects of malnutrition, overexertion, physical punishment, and unsheltered sleeping on the deck fostered a significant mortality rate among crew members, who experienced a death rate of about 1 person per 4.7 tons of cargo. And this is at a time when the average galleon carried between 300 and 2,000 tons per voyage. So a little quick math, that's between 64 to 426 lives lost every voyage east, every voyage back to North America. In order to attenuate this death toll and guarantee a smoother operation of imperial trade, Spain began searching for possible ports along the coast of what would become Alta California and later California. Throughout this period of speculation, especially the late 16th century, but it went on a bit, Spanish travelers often wrote about the region's environments in rhapsodic tones. Sebastian Rodriguez Cermeño, who made port along the coast in 1592, wrote that the soil would, quote, return any kind of seed that could be sown. 11 years later, Sebastian Vizcaíno led an expedition of 3 ships north from Acapulco. During the voyage, Vizcaíno encountered many indigenous settlements and people whom he characterized as, quote, affable and inoffensive. And he mapped Spanish names onto the territory, many of which remain today. In a letter submitted to the king upon his return to Acapulco, Vizcaíno noted that the soil was, quote, very fertile, and he had urged the crown to colonize the region immediately. The Vizcaíno's report did not result in the immediate conquest. It informed Spain's return to the region in 1776, shaping the patterns of settlement, genocide, and environmental extraction that would follow. Next slide, please. Though the Manila galleon trade offers one origin point for California speculations, it was not necessarily the first vision of a colonized California. In his study of oral history among California indigenous people, William J. Bauer Jr., a Concow scholar, encounters cultures of indigenous prophecy that are said to predate conquest. One prophecy told to him by Lucy Young, a LASIK woman, held that, quote, California Indians discovered the settlers before the settlers discovered them, end quote. And contemporary poet Shawno Tecumseh's poem Yurok Geography places a Yurok cosmology of the Klamath in conversation, Klamaths and sort of on the Pacific slope in what we would call today present like Northern California. So places a Yurok cosmology of the Klamath in conversation with the prophecy of colonization that straddles the past and present. And I'll just do a full reading of the poem here if you all don't mind. Before the idea of continental drift, before there were maps that depicted this continent, the Klamath River bisected the world. Traveling upriver, you came to saltwater, downriver to saltwater again. Every journey from the center came to the fog at the edge of the earth. The spirit beings told us the others live with them in across the ocean land. They told us the secret of their coming, so we were ready. Ready when they drew lines around us. We were ready to learn our new geography, a new spatial concept, demarcation, 1 mile on each side of the river. We anticipated the change, adapted to township, range, section, and the Klamath remains. It still cuts through, splits the heart. In her poem, Macovey writes of Yurok geography as something that both predates and also predicts settlers' imposition of California as, quote, a new geography, a new spatial concept, one which seeks to impose a settler order of knowledge and empire onto the Klamath watershed, an order which would be cited to justify settler projects of genocide, dispossession, clear-cut logging, and water diversion for corporate agriculture. Should also mention really intensive marijuana cultivation, which is sort of corporate or paracorporate, depending on when in the history you're looking. Along with challenging settler speculations of conquest and alienable abundance, Macovey's poem articulates an indigenous epistemology of resistance and survivance, one that challenges the perceptual limitations of settler history and speculation. For Macovey, this critique includes a recognition that the multi-species worlds of the Klamath are populated by spirit beings and other human relations whom Yurok peoples recognize as relations to whom they have responsibilities of respect and reciprocity. Next slide, please. Ohlone Costanoan Esalen author Deborah Miranda's memoir, Bad Indians, also uses speculation to challenge settler histories of Spanish missionization, including friars' attempts to break indigenous peoples' bonds with each other in the multi-species world. Working in a mode of perception and interdependence that Melanie K. Yazzie, who's Dine, and Kucharising Baldi, who's Hupa and Yurok, call radical relationality, Miranda's Bad Indians uses archival speculation to write indigenous worlds back into the archives of missionization, and it does so by articulating speculative visions of indigenous abundance that weave together strands of kinship, affect, survival, and multi-species relations. And if you haven't read the book, it's wonderful. And there's these different there's a part that's like a glossary, and it's a satirical kind of speculative history work. In an entry in this glossary titled Bells, Miranda throws the missionary structures of order and domination into relief against a robust tide of sardines that arrives from the Pacific. The transient abundance of sardines ruptures the temporality of the mission as the bells hang silent while the plural first-person we is able to move outside the friar systems of surveillance. And if you don't mind clicking once here. Families who are separated by labor during the day and by the dangerous single-gender sleeping quarters or mancherios at night are reunited in acts of harvesting, eating, resting, and playing that last for days along the coast. Miranda writes, quote, friends rested together, gossiping. Daughters normally sequestered in the mangerio leaned against their mothers contentedly. Children ate their fill, slept on warm sand with bones still tight in their fists. Our souls swam gratefully into dream, whole and unbroken. The Padre stood to one side, watched, laughed to see us at such ease. End quote. By weaving this moment into her broader speculative history and critique of missionization, Miranda frames the arrival of sardine abundance as something that emerges outside the structures of mission life, disrupting mission labor, however briefly. The Padres, she notes, quote, have no way to store such bounty, and the bells fall silent as families on the beach experience otherwise forbidden moments of intimacy and freedom, facilitated by this relational encounter with more than human abundance. In Miranda's skillful rendition, this transient abundance articulates another kind of relation to land and among Indigenous people, one that enacts a kind of loophole of retreat from the mission system's extractive violences. As Mishuana Goeman has argued, we must, quote, understand the processes that have defined our current spatialities in order to sustain vibrant native futures, end quote. In this scene from Bad Indians, Miranda, like Shauna Oteka-Micovi, articulates a spatiality outside of conquest, one whose ontologies of being and relation move outside and against the temporalities and civic entrapments of mission life, and outside and against the speculations of extractable abundance that have authored and sustained the colonization of California. As it emerges and gains texture, the speculative episode underscores the limitations of mission hegemony and the settler ecologies that worlded California into being, using instrumentalist and extractive orders of knowledge that refuse to relate to ecological abundance in the living world on reciprocal terms. In this way, Miranda's speculative sardine tide authors and recuperates an unwritten episode of Indigenous resistance, one whose modes of evasion and relation have always incorporated a radical relationality with the multi-species world. In this way, both Miranda and Micovi craft visionary works that suggest that pre- and para-California worlds have always existed before, outside, beyond, and against the settler speculations that have worked across time to construct California as a site of imperial domination, profit, extraction, and dispossession. Thank you. All right, so that's all of the papers. Jeff, do you want to facilitate the discussion?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I, from what I understand, if anybody in our audience has a question, they are to type it into chat. Am I right about that? But first they have to, well, I'm assuming if they're already here participating that they've already registered, right? So, and I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box unless I'm not looking at this correctly.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any either. Maybe we can give folks a minute to think about or share questions. Yeah. In the meantime, I just want to say how much I appreciate everyone's papers. I mean, I really love all the connections that emerge between the different work. Maybe one of our speakers has a question or comment.
I have a question for everyone. And actually, real quick, Chris, can participants also raise their hands if they want to ask questions?
Yes, if participants want to appear on screen, they can raise their hand. Otherwise, they can just ask a question in the chat. If you do want to appear on screen, though, you'll be in the permanent recording, so fair warning.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. Yeah, I was just curious if maybe everyone might comment on this one part that's in the abstract for the paper or for our panel that I'm curious about in each of our cases, or just your thoughts generally. So we wrote, it also, our approach, our Transpacific and hemispheric approach, provides an opportunity to put Asian diasporic and Indigenous stories alongside one another to identify intersections for engaging in direct action and creating horizontal networks of care as part of public life. And I can put that in the chat if that's helpful, but I'm wondering how you see these stories that we're putting alongside one another as identifying some intersections for direct action or
I can begin. Thanks, Lisa, for highlighting and amplifying that part in the abstract. I think it's very important because it makes me think of, when I think of solidarities and entanglements, I also think of how I'm learning from those who have come before me in this space as a migrant diasporic person. And what I've learned from, example, Rita Wong and what she's doing on the ground here in British Columbia is, and from what I understand and from what I personally theorize from her actions, and this is how I'm thinking through my own actions, is if my body as a female Filipino woman is used and seen by nation state, not just the North American nation states, but also my native nation state as something that is of an economic resource. I'd like to think of now reclaiming my body as something that can be active in solidarity with Indigenous communities here and all over the world. And I'm thinking of the whole entire body if we go to protests and if we, enact action in our own ways. So I think that's one way of thinking horizontally. Again, I go back to the challenge of decolonization right now. What does it mean to decolonize beyond borders or across borders? And we're seeing this unfold before us. When we think of horizontal, and I think horizontal networks of care for public life, for me, I'm starting to use this, whatever this body is allowed to do in the archives. And I think this relates to Jane's work, because in the archives, it's an entirely different experience for me. My goal is, when I go into the archives, is how can I publicize what I find there, to illuminate information, vital historical information for the publics, so that, again, I challenge what it means to be an arrivant here in North America. And what I discover in the archives is quite effective, affective in that sense. The archive can be an inherently violent place, but if my body can be in the archives, with the archives, and if I can translate that information to the public, I think that's like a starting point that a lot of folks begin with, I would say. And again, I'm just starting to learn, and I'm learning with those that came before me.
Question in the chat from Lisa Fink.
Thanks, Chris.
That was me just typing up the question that I just asked.
Lisa, did you want to respond to it? That isn't like a prompt. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't cutting you off.
Sure, I can respond to my own question. Although I will say, something that Rena was just sharing had me thinking about Jane's paper, which I was really interested in how the different, and maybe you addressed this and I missed it, but how the different labor struggles that were going on in the coal mines were, how they might be intersecting or influencing each other. Like, did certain labor, concessions that laborers got in some struggles, like how did that shift other labor struggles? So I don't know if you want to talk about that, but just in terms of answering the question really quickly, I'll say, for me, I think about this a lot in terms of just honoring Indigenous sovereignty. And in the case of, thinking about responding to species that are considered invasive. So as related to my research with the Anishinaabe, their sovereignty is often very limited by the state and how they would like to respond to these species, and how they even think about belonging. And so in terms of kind of horizontal networks of care and direct action, I think anything that supports Indigenous sovereignty so that Native nations can articulate their own, membership in terms of human beings, but but also, thinking beyond that to other groups of people and other, non-human beings. So they, their way, at least the way they described to me, their way of understanding relations, which was, outside of colonial and capitalist relations. They wanted to engage both with people and beings from elsewhere in a very different way than they were kind of, in some ways, forced to do by the state in a variety of ways that I won't go into, but I will.
I'd like to also address your question, Lisa, which I think is a wonderful question, and I like how you you're referring back to the amazing proposal, right, that was created for our panel. I'm struck by in thinking about all of your papers that this past year, especially this semester, I have mentioned a number of these topics in my own teaching. So, Lisa, I'm thinking about your question in terms of pedagogy, right? Because very often the stories that we put alongside one another also have I think a pedagogical mode to them. I mean, these are works that we teach ourselves to our students. And I'm especially thinking about this, Alyssa, right, in your paper where you referred to the poetry of Kathy Jitnil Kijner and Craig Santos Perez. And both of those poets, I've taught their work this past semester in an undergraduate class, an undergraduate course that I taught on migrant literature and environmental justice. And it just so happened that we were reading together Chanting the Waters, Santos Perez's magnificent poem, to end the semester, while at the same time, right outside my class, at Stony Brook University, the student activists were setting up the encampment, and they were also chanting. They weren't chanting Santos Perez's poems, but I do know, right, that we were reading the poem together, and each of those parts in the poem that's recited over and over, water is, and it appears as a blank in the poem, but we all filled that in as life. So we were singing water is life, because water is life. That gets repeated over and over. And when we were doing this in the classroom, it was in sync with the chanting outside in the protests at, when they were setting up the encampment. And so I think to answer your question, Lisa, I'm thinking about how the stories that we put alongside one another, right? That they have this intersectionality, right? At least, especially when it comes to our pedagogy, right? So I think your question is wonderful for thinking about what it is that we do in the classroom, what it is we offer to our students that has direct application, right? It has this kind of transness, right, to what's happening in the real world today. And I would argue that that those horizontal networks of care, as each of your papers has shown, has direct articulation and consequence, I think, to justice, right? To thinking about, Indigenous justice, because they all intersect, right? In terms of protesting to stop the war in Gaza, so justice, for Palestine, but also climate justice. Also, Black Lives Matter, racial justice, right? So all of these things, they connect together in this intersectionality. So that's just what I wanted to say. That's what I was thinking of, right? When I was listening to each of your papers, each of your works. And I guess if I had a question, right? I mean, I think you all in one way or another mentioned the word justice, right? But I'd be curious to know how you would see, right, the question of pedagogy, right? If that's also something to consider in terms of the work that you do.
I can respond, or try to. Sort of, like, forgive me, my brain's sort of caught between your question about pedagogy, Jeff, and Lisa's question, and also that striking sort of moment in Enchanting the Waters that, Alyssa, you bring up about sort of the water, like the different sort of waters as interconnected homelands, right? Like rivers and oceans. In my work, part of what I've been thinking about is, I think abundance is one of those sort of ideas that I've been trying to tunnel into when I think about California. But part of it is like, I feel like caught between sort of Anthropocene futures and presents and like how we got here. And in California, it's so many places, so entangled between settler colonialism, dispossession, and the legalization of enslavement of Indigenous people in the state, and genocide, right? And these iterative waves of both extraction and environmental manipulation to continue extraction. So and how these meet, to me, in like agriculture really significantly, especially because of California's particular like global economic character and national economic character, and how the enslavement of Indigenous people was used to propel a rapid extraction of the abundance that those Indigenous societies had cultivated over, like, since time immemorial, right? And through relations with the land, and how as settler violence led to a decimation of Indigenous peoples' populations and a like decimation of that environment, how the manipulation of water itself was used to try to sustain commercial patterns by creating a sort of industrial abundance, and how that worked in tandem with something like the invasion of the Philippines and the Tidings-McGuffey Act, which brought Filipino migrants and laborers to California and Alaska and other places in the U.S. for exploitation and extractive industry, hand in hand with the exploitation of, Latino people who were also in those fields and who were organizing together, and to me, in my teaching and in my writing, the question I have is like, what lessons does that offer us about the future and potential futures in California? Because, for example, I look at McCovey's poem, and the Klamath Dams, the lower Fork Klamath Dams are being removed, but so much of the resistance to that removal and what it can do for the tribes on the Klamath is about agriculture and senior water rights. And you trace it back to the Homestead Act, right, which is happening at around the same time as the Tidings-McGuffey Act. And I'm just thinking, like, I mean, I don't know. In my work, I try to think about how does, in this paper, how are there alternative registers of abundance? How is this posture of abundance one of settler domination and industrial manipulation, right? And how do we, how does understanding that help us think about either novel or resurgent solidarities across communities? And I teach at San Jose State, so like, it's a like minority majority institution, and for me as a white settler scholar and teacher, trying to think about, especially finishing a book, how do I shift my critical work toward a work that matters to my students, you know, and that engages the communities where I'm living. I'm not sure what that looks like yet on the ground in terms of my sort of next projects or embodied work, but it's something that's sort of like Rena, I'm really interested in, like, what can this body do, right? And who can I be in solidarity with in that way?
I don't want to totally sidestep Jeff's question, but I did want to respond to the one that Lisa posed to me earlier. And I think I can actually connect it to some of the really interesting stuff that Daniel was just saying, and also that Rena raised earlier with regards to archives and these historical examples that I'm working with. I mean, just to Rena, I'm thinking about archive quite expansively because there are no sort of, there are very few sort of like formal or official records from, like, let's say, Chinese workers' labor actions or Indigenous workers' actions, where then we have to look at oral histories, and I'm sort of sifting through all these kinds of materials that we wouldn't conventionally think of as like an archive, a labor history archive. And I'd probably, hopefully we can talk about it more. It's certainly an affected experience, right? I would agree. But I think to Lisa's question, it's really interesting. There are like, it's been very hard for me to corroborate like the sort of bits and pieces about the potential like explicit solidarities between, like, let's say a Chinese workers' labor action and like a Nanaima labor action. Like, it's clear that they're happening around the same time in the early 20th century. No records that I've come across yet where, like, let's say these workers decided to go out on strike together, except with the exception of actually at the very first coal mine on Vancouver Island, the Scottish miners who I mentioned in my paper, who the Quagos, whose arrival the Quagos protested, basically because they were saying, you're already taking our land and you're taking the resources from it, and now you're bringing in other workers to take the jobs we have. This is just unacceptable. So the Quagos had been protesting the arrival of the Scottish miners. After months, the issue basically resolved because there was a clear sort of division of labor. The Scottish miners were digging the pit while the Quagos workers were working at the surface. But then the Scottish miners struck themselves because they were frustrated by the conditions that the company was subjecting them to. And the company threw them in prison for striking. And so the Quagos started to, and these Scottish miners had brought their families, like wives and children with them. And the Quagos started trading, basically giving food to the Scottish women and children to keep them alive. And I think there, right, we have to read between the lines because the records we have are like the journals of company agents, but there is a recognition of a shared sort of subjugation to or shared oppression at the hands of the Hudson's Bay Company, which is like establishing the settler colony by extracting these resources and also extracting wealth from these differently racialized groups of workers. So even though there had previously been a racial antagonism, at some point they've recognized a sort of shared exploitation by the company and actually do overcome that in these, again, informal, like, speaking of horizontal networks, these are not like registered labor unions in the way that we recognize them today or something, but they're nevertheless these sort of solidaristic formations. And I think there are probably a lot of other instances of that between various racialized groups. Although we have to really the kind of archival work we end up doing to determine that is like not the sort of conventional way we would do that.
I want to try to, I want to try to answer this question about pedagogy. My mind is really swirling in a lot of ways, and thank you, Jeff, for that story too. This really amazing story about, you know, the ways that the classroom became connected with, you know, the encampment and fights for justice for Palestinians. I'm coming from a very different context at Oklahoma State, surprisingly. There's a very quiet campus. Many of our students are completely unaware of what's happening, both in Palestine, but also just across the US and across colleges. And so one way I'm thinking about this both pedagogically and for the question of like, I should say we did have a rally. One rally happened on campus very, very recently. But I'm teaching classes in Indigenous literatures, and many of the students have not heard anything, right? Like they were completely shocked to hear both about the genocide, but also about all of the many actions that were happening on college campuses across the country. And this has been happening as we're reading a novel at the end of the class by Leanne Howe called Miko Kings that's about Oklahoma statehood. So I like to end that class back in Oklahoma thinking about how it's connected to Stillwater's history and OSU's history. And that novel also opens with a Palestinian character. And so that became like one way of tying in both what's happening, why haven't we heard about this, right? Where is it that how has this story gone missing? But also what does it mean for this novel that's specifically about Oklahoma's history, Oklahoma Native tribes, to open in Palestine? And that's one way I've been thinking about engaging this idea of reading alongside. Chadwick Allen has a really great essay on teaching global Indigenous literatures as one of juxtaposition rather than comparison. And so I often open my classes with that idea as well, as like how do we think about reading through juxtaposition rather than like an idea of sameness. And that's also part of what really intrigues me about General Kidner and Perez's approach to No DAPL, is that it's not one of conflating necessarily, it's one that's specifically grounded in Dakota context.
Well, I know that, Lisa, you asked in the chat if any of our participants or anybody in our audience has a question. I'm still not seeing one. So does anybody else have a question or even just a comment? Anybody that wants to say anything?
I'd love to say something, or to just draw a connection that I saw between this sort of pedagogy question and Lisa's work, if you guys don't mind. So Lisa, we've been fellow travelers for a while now. And whenever I talk about exotic species in my classes, I introduce alienated species, the ways that you approach it. And students often find it very engaging. And so I teach a GE class, and it's like moderate size, for a teaching university called Nature and World Cultures. And, you know, the class is sort of framed around settler colonialism, indigenous, environmental management and decolonial ecologies, environmental justice and climate justice are sort of the different frames. And we finished with Northern Light, Kazim Ali's book this semester, and had a great discussion. And then students went off and did research projects, right? And they're supposed to engage with one of these concepts and kind of think toward the future. And one of my students did a project, or one group did a project on Cafe Ohlone in the East Bay, which is actually established on UC Berkeley's campus as part of their ongoing efforts to sort of towards some kind of reconciliation or reparations. But the cafe is really interesting. It's two Ohlone guys who are, right now it's sort of there, but there was the recent return of the Shell Mound in Berkeley, and there's a look toward using that land in part to cultivate and create food. But it was interesting to see some of the students had some of the recipes from the website integrating in alienated species, you know, as part of these like recuperation of traditional dishes. And I just thought it was really beautiful. And I thought of your work in that moment, and like, I think the resonance it has to thinking, you know, and to kind of dislodging these settler assumptions about what Indigenous relationships to the multi-species world and to different beings are, right? And so I just wanted to share that. Yeah.
Well, I know that I think our time is up, or it's long past, but I just want to direct your attention that there are 2 comments from our audience members. Jeannie Shinozuka, thanks for sharing your work. Everyone, this is great. And Linda Rousseau writes, thank you for these rich and thought-provoking presentations. So I think that's a really lovely way for us to conclude our panel, right? So I just want to thank all of you, right, for your exciting work. And I look forward to meeting you all again at some point. And thanks to all of you in our audience who came to our panel and listened to us. Very much appreciated. Okay. All right. Bye, everybody.